All right, we will begin with the topic on your outline, war, and we're going to start with the first battle of the American Revolution, and that's Lexington Concord. So the Patriots had begun to raise defense forces in order to protect themselves against any sort of British attack with the increased British military presence in the colonies. And this is just on a colonial basis, like each colony has its own militia organized, and they called themselves the Minutemen because they would be ready to fight battle at a minute's notice, basically. They're just always on the lookout. So Massachusetts is going to be declared in a state of rebellion. Obviously, there's been an increased number of British soldiers here, like over the past couple of years. But the British soldiers were given an order to head to Concord, Massachusetts to capture colonial leaders and supplies, such as weapons, ammunitions, etc. So they're on their way to Concord to do that when leaders like Paul Revere and Samuel Prescott and William Dawes are able to ride through the night and warn the Patriots and the colonial militia and Minutemen that the British troops were coming to attack. So the colonial militia is ready to meet the British at Lexington, which is a town a little bit ahead of Concord. So the troops are on the way to Concord, but the colonists cut them off at Lexington, where the first shots are fired out at the Revolution, of the Revolution. And this is what's known as the shot heard around the world. Now, the colonists are outnumbered, so they have to retreat back to Concord. But at Concord, they are much more prepared. They had a larger group there, and they were able to force the British all the way back to Boston, which is where they had been traveling from to head towards Concord. So this means that fighting in the Revolutionary War has begun, but independence has not yet been declared. Like, the colonists do not know what they're fighting for, but it is the first time you did have the colonial military and the British military meet and do battle. And when I mentioned Paul Revere and the others riding through the night, that is, Paul Revere, the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. I'm sure you've heard the poem by Longfellow. Or no, he came saying, the British are coming, kind of giving warning to the impending attack, which is why they were able to cut them off at Lexington. The second battle we're going to talk about is Bunker Hill. Kind of a coincidence that it's named Bunker Hill, because most of the fighting of this actual battle took place at a different location, Breed's Hill, but you don't need to know that. Just know the battle is known as Bunker Hill, right outside of Boston. So, in the Battle of Bunker Hill, the colonists are going to be overrun by the British due to their lack of supplies. It was a multiple day fight. It wasn't a quick fight like Lexington and Concord. Even though the colonists lose the battle, it's actually a moral victory for them because they were able to inflict high casualties on the British. And they're really only defeated because of their lack of supplies, so it kind of showed that they had a chance at holding their own, and they don't even really have an actual organized army yet, so that's very impressive for them to be doing that well, because no one really expects them to be able to do well against the British. Honestly, they don't have half the resources that England has, so the fact that they're holding their own is impressive. The last kind of conflict I want to talk about is a conflict in Virginia. With the Revolutionary War underway, fighting would expand into the Virginia colony. There is a royal governor in Virginia at this time, Lord Dunmore, and he wants to contain the revolutionary movement. He is loyalist because he's a royal governor, so he's appointed by Britain, so he wants to try to tone down the colonial resistance in Virginia. He's going to put Virginia under martial law, which puts the military in charge. And then he issues a proclamation that offers freedom to slaves and indentured servants who would join the British cause. So if a slave would run away from their master and join the British side, and if the British were able to quell the rebellion, then those slaves would be freed. Many slaves will join that cause with the promise of freedom, but this is actually going to cause even more colonists to join the patriot cause, because especially in the South, they're very protective over their right to possess and maintain the institution of slavery at this time. So this is going to cause an even larger enemy base for Dunmore, and Dunmores are eventually totally defeated by the colonists. So his methods were not effective in terms of trying to grant slaves freedom. You do have a lot of African slaves as well as indentured servants fight for the British crown with the hopes of achieving freedom, but it won't pan out in their favor in the long run. All right, so now we're going to talk about the process of actually declaring independence, because like I said, even though the war's begun, we don't yet know what we're fighting for. So after Lexington and Concord, the first shots, the Second Continental Congress will convene in Philadelphia. And the first thing the Congress actually thinks needs to happen is they will officially create the Continental Army, which is the whole colonial army, not just like a colony by colony militia, but an actually like organized colonial military force called the Continental Army. And George Washington was named as the commanding general of this group. Now, despite fighting, most are still hoping to achieve peace with England. So this is going to be one last attempt at achieving colonial peace with England through a document called the Olive Branch Petition. Now, you know, an olive branch is a symbol for peace. This legislation was addressed directly to King George III, sent directly to him and him alone. They hoped to appeal to him. They pledged their loyalty to their king. They asked him to respect the liberties of the colonists by, having Parliament back off, by repealing the recent oppressive legislation, by removing all the British troops that are in the colonies, and they're really trying to appeal to his sympathies. But unfortunately, this will be ineffective. King George would not accept the petition, and he inevitably declared that all colonies were in a state of rebellion. He will even go as far after this to hire about 30,000 German mercenaries, or Hessians, which is spelled Hessians. I realized I didn't have that spelled on the outline. But he will hire these German mercenaries to go into the colonies and fight for England. Now, the reason he has to hire soldiers, he can't afford to send high numbers of his own British troops. He's already sent a lot of British troops over to the colonies, but England has a presence elsewhere in the world, obviously, so he needs other soldiers for hire to help fight this war. So he's basically going to pay a mercenary as a soldier for hire. They're just fighting for a paycheck, basically, from Germany. So that's going to come into advantages and disadvantages a little bit later in this chapter, but just know that he does hire those German soldiers to fight for the British side. I want to address really quickly before we get to the Declaration, the pamphlet written by Thomas Paine, that's known as Common Sense. That's the name of the pamphlet. Thomas Paine was an Englishman, so he's from Great Britain, but he came to America around this time, about 1774, in part because he supported the American cause and the American protests against England. And he's going to write this pamphlet called Common Sense as a means of advocating for independence, where he basically says it is common sense that the colonists of, America would want to rebel and break away from British control. This pamphlet was extremely effective at gaining colonial support for the idea of independence from England because, again, that's a hard idea for them to accept because they are British citizens and they don't really want in their hearts to be independent from England, but he's kind of making them realize they don't really have much other option at this point. So this pamphlet is very helpful at swaying opinions in favor of independence, and the timing of this pamphlet will definitely affect the decisions at the Second Continental Congress, because that meeting is still convened, and they will realize that the people are now calling for independence. It's not a silly idea anymore, or an idea of just a few people. Many people are having the idea now. So there's a lot of public support, and part of that public support comes from Thomas Paine's common sense. All right, so let's get to the Declaration itself. Thomas Jefferson will write the Declaration of Independence. He'll have some help, of course, from Franklin, John Adams, but he's the author. And Jefferson is very inspired and influenced by the ideas of John Locke in this writing. A few quotes here, not that you have to memorize them, but just to give examples of this. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another. Kind of talking about sometimes it's justifiable to dissolve political connections with your government if they have become oppressive. He also says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that are among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which is a direct reference to John Locke's natural rights, life, liberty, and property. This document is stating that King George has broken his governing contract with the colonies, and it actually lists grievances and cites specific examples as to how King George has broken his governing contract with colonies. It kind of says he has done this, he has done this, he has allowed Parliament to do this, he has not given them representation in Parliament, he has not allowed them to be freed of these increased British soldiers. This document, y'all, is the first document of its kind in world history. Never before had a group of colonies listed its grievances, declared itself to be an independent state, and asserted its own sovereignty apart from its federal government. So this document will have global impacts. But now we see what the colonists are claiming that they're fighting for. They've been fighting for over a year at this point, because this is about a year after Lexington and Concord. Now they know what they're fighting for, and that's to be independent. This document appealed to the quote-unquote rest of mankind to recognize that the U.S. was free and independent from England. So that's kind of the purpose of declaring independence. They want to declare publicly their independence from Great Britain. Now that doesn't make them free. They still have to win the war, but this is them acknowledging that in their eyes they are free and sovereign and independent from England. After much debate in Congress, the Declaration is officially issued on July 4th, 1776. And I want you to know that date, and you see all those signatures at the bottom of the document. Kind of consider for a second what would happen to the men who signed this document if they lost the war. That's going to be the first people that Parliament and King George come after. I want to finish today with just one quick little note about the Articles of Confederation. This is something we're going to spend a lot more time on in Unit 3, but it happens at this point in history, so I wanted to introduce it for now. The Articles of Confederation was the first written form of government for the United States. Soon after declaring independence, the Second Continental Congress realized they need to form a legitimate national government to stay organized and to have a system in place in case they do win this war. So they draft their document as the Articles of Confederation, which set up a very weak national government. Keep in mind, they don't want to have what they are used to being under English control. So they're trying to kind of limit their power of their national government. There's only one branch, the legislative branch. The majority of the power was within the states, but that will overall create a very weak system. So it will not last, but it was created at this Congress. Please write down any questions, and we'll go over this tomorrow.